Daw QC rejoins us. Chris, so thank you for bearing with us on the tech. Do you believe that the balance has been got right here between the security of the public and the rights of anybody who ends up inside the prison system for whatever reason?
Well, Tom, listen, we can't talk about this individual case in quite that way because there's a jury that's deciding this inquest, and they'll return verdicts in due course on these very points. So we have to be very, very careful that nothing we say may influence this particular case. But dealing with it in the more general way, if I can put it in this way, your previous contributor was absolutely right. There are processes whereby release can be considered where someone would ordinarily automatically be released, and there does require a process to be gone through. But ultimately, even if there is some delay in release, there will come a point, unless someone is serving a life sentence to apply for parole and satisfy the parole board that they're safe to be released, they will be released. And one thing I would say to sort of reassure the public, it may not particularly in the context of this case, but if the police have evidence that someone is actively planning to be involved in terrorism in some way, that they support a terrorist organisation or such like, and that they are continuing that activity in the prison environment, they can be charged with further crimes.
Yeah.
And if someone's charged with further crimes, then of course they can be remanded in custody, even if they were due for release on their previous sentence. So where someone is actively supporting or otherwise promoting terrorist agendas, or even supporting a terrorist organisation, nevertheless, even if they're not actually engaged in terrorist kind of planning or acting, they can be charged. And often that does happen, that people are charged with further crimes while they're in prison, and then they'll remain in custody after they would have been released for the original crime.
Sorry, Chris, can I come back to this issue of separation in prisons, which has been talked about a lot? And indeed, I was cited by Ian Aitchison, who's Director of Community Safety at the Home Office for a while, in a piece that he wrote the other day. He said that even as late as May this year, the Director of High Security Prisons had to be reminded by counsel at the inquest into the Fishmongers Hall murders, that was a separate terror attack, that despite his revelation that there was very considerable debate internally over the merits of separation, it was in fact government policy. Ian Aitchison says the wheels have spun on decisive action for far too long. Would you agree with that?
I wrote extensively about the Fishmongers Hall attack in my book, Justice on Trial, so I know that case very, very well. And one thing I would say is that it's absolutely clear that those involved in the most serious kinds of terrorist attack are not being handled correctly in our prison system. They are still frequently being allowed to associate with each other. They are still being allowed to continue to read literature and to become involved in some of the worst sort of thought processes that lead to these most awful attacks on random members of the public. So whatever is being done in the prison system, it's not working, because the Fishmongers Hall attack was a classic example where someone had been in prison for a full 8 years. 8 full years in a Category A prison environment, came out and within a year murdered 2 innocent young people. That is telling you something about the tragic and devastating mistakes that are being made in our prison service.
And very quickly, Chris, what are the major mistakes that are being made, if indeed it is government policy to actually separate those with those views?
Well, government policy alone doesn't dictate what happens in prison. The prisons are run on the basis of the prison rules and on legislation, not just what the government has as a policy at any given time. So prison rules are not just arbitrary government policy. But what it's telling us is this, that our prisons are failing. They're failing us in terrorist cases. They're failing us in serious criminal cases. They're failing us in almost every category of case, because what happens when people go to prison is 75% of the time, whether they're terrorists or otherwise, they come out and commit more crime. So our prison system is failing, and one of the reasons for that is because prison fundamentally does not work in preventing people from reoffending when they get released. And terrorist cases are one of the primary examples of that. We've seen some of the most tragic and awful murders committed by people who have been in prison, not just in this case as it was for, I think, less than 2 years, but people who have been in prison for almost a decade have come out and committed serious terrorist crimes. We need to have a complete overhaul of the way we deal with people in prison. It's not just about solitary confinement. It's about making sure that when people are released, they are fit to be released. They are safe to be released into the public, and many times they're not.
We've seen that, as you say, in relation to terrorist events, but also in other crimes as well, where the parole board have made a decision and then had to reverse it. Chris Daw, good to speak with you. Thank you for your time. Chris Daw QC, criminal barrister at Millennium Chambers, author of the new book, Justice on Trial.